The first thing that broke was not a ship or a city or a line of soldiers, but an assumption. For generations uncounted, the Tarethi conclave had believed that resistance followed predictable curves, that civilizations, when pressed, would either harden into brittle defiance or soften into surrender. Their archivists had charts for it, their strategists had models refined across the conquest of 1,000 worlds. When the conclave's black-latticed vessels crossed into the Sol system, they carried those assumptions like sacred instruments, polished and unquestioned. Humanity shattered them before the first planetary hour had passed. From the command cradle of the vessel's vast calculation, strategist Kelvaris observed the blue-white sphere designated Sol 3. It spun with a careless grace, oceans flashing like exposed nerves, cloud systems swirling without regard for the fleet assembling above it. The planet radiated life and industry, electromagnetic chatter spilling into space in chaotic abundance. Kelvaris tasted the data through neural filaments and found it inelegant, uncompressed, almost wasteful. Such species always were. They shouted into the void, then wondered why something answered. The conclave had announced itself with mathematical courtesy, a transmission describing annexation terms, resource quotas, cultural preservation limits. There had been no threats, no boasts. Threats were inefficient, and boasting betrayed insecurity. The transmission ended with a temporal window for compliance, generous by conclave standards. On 100 previous worlds, this had been enough. The locals would argue posture, perhaps even fire a symbolic volley, then their leadership would accept reality. Sol 3 replied in less than 90 of its own seconds. The reply was not a formal surrender or even a unified statement. It was noise. Millions of signals layered atop one another, languages overlapping, images of faces, diagrams, fragments of mathematics, historical footage, satire, defiance, confusion, and naked fear all bleeding together. For an instant, conclave filters strained to parse it. Then, like a hand closing around a throat, the noise condensed into a single phrase, translated by sheer statistical weight rather than intent. No. Kelvaris felt something akin to curiosity. It was not the refusal itself that intrigued them, but the manner of it. The species had not selected a leader to speak, had not chosen a single rhetorical frame. They had refused as a swarm, as a distributed entity. That suggested either profound disorganization or a deeper, emergent cohesion. The conclave had encountered both before, only one ever proved costly. Begin Phase 1, Kelvaris instructed, their voice a harmonic vibration transmitted through the vessel's spine. Demonstrate inevitability. Above the planet, space folded with controlled violence as kinetic platforms deployed. They were elegant structures, all angles and negative space, designed to intimidate through visible superiority. Power readings spiked. Targeting solutions resolved around uninhabited regions, chosen carefully to minimize loss of life while maximizing psychological impact. A measured strike to show that resistance was futile but mercy remained available. The first impact struck an empty ocean, carving trenches of superheated vapor miles long. Water flashed into plasma, then rained back down as scalding storms. Satellites burned. Shockwaves rippled through the atmosphere. The conclave waited for panic, for pleas, for the familiar cascade of surrender signals. Instead, the noise changed. Human transmissions did not diminish. They intensified, but with a new texture. The initial chaos sharpened into patterns, networks rerouted around destroyed infrastructure with startling speed. Civilian channels fell silent as military bands surged to the forefront. There was fear, unmistakable and raw, but it rode alongside something else, something harder to quantify. Anger, yes, but also focus. Resolve. On the surface, Captain Joran Malvek watched the sky burn. He stood on the open deck of the Bastion of Rains, a mobile defense platform anchored to a high plateau where thin air met wide horizons. The platform's hull vibrated beneath his boots as power systems surged. Above him, contrails of dying satellites traced frantic arcs, brief stars snuffed out one by one. Joran had trained his entire life for war, but not for this. No simulation captured the way the air seemed to thicken when the heavens themselves turned hostile. "Status," he said, keeping his voice steady by habit rather than confidence. "Orbital assets at 40% and falling," replied Tactical Officer Seren Kale, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. "Global command is fragmented but stabilizing. They're trying to herd us into unified response clusters." Joran snorted softly. "Trying." Despite everything, a grim pride stirred in his chest. Humanity had never been good at unity until it was forced upon them. Now, with extinction hanging overhead like a blade, old rivalries blurred. Borders mattered less when the sky itself was an enemy. "Any response from the visitors?" Joran asked. "They're holding position," Seren said. "Watching?" "Of course they are," Joran murmured. "They think this is theater." He turned back to the sky, jaw set. Somewhere up there, minds utterly alien were judging them, measuring their worth in equations and probabilities. Joran wondered what those minds would make of a species that had spent centuries inventing new ways to hurt itself and then, inexplicably, refusing to die. The first counterstrike was not elegant. It was not unified. It was not even particularly effective by Conclave standards. It was 1,000 different weapons fired by 1,000 different commands, everything humanity could throw upward in a desperate, furious arc. Missiles clawed at the void, rail slugs screamed into vacuum, energy beams lanced and dissipated against shields designed to shrug off far worse. Kelvaris observed it all with clinical detachment. Primitive, they assessed, as expected. Yet as the data streamed in, anomalies flickered at the edges. A missile altered course mid-flight in a way that suggested adaptive guidance far more flexible than anticipated. A kinetic slug struck a shield node at an odd angle, not penetrating, but causing a resonance spike that rippled across the lattice. Minor, easily corrected, but unexpected. "Update threat models," Kelvaris ordered. "Increase adaptive variance." The Conclave fleet responded with restrained precision. Defensive fire erased incoming projectiles. A second demonstration strike carved a barren desert into molten glass. Still no surrender, still no collapse. Instead, human signals began to include something new, questions, not pleas, but inquiries. Probes of Conclave communications, attempts to understand the invaders' technology, structure, intent. "They are studying us," noted substrategist Vethrix, their fronds twitching in faint agitation. "In the midst of bombardment." "Of course they are," Kelvaris replied. "Curiosity is a common reflex in sentient species facing the unknown." "Not like this," Vethrix said. "They are aggressive about it." On Sol 3, in a reinforced chamber buried beneath layers of rock and alloy, analyst Mara Quent folded her hands to keep them from shaking. Data streamed across the walls, projections overlapping in controlled chaos. She had slept less than 3 hours since the first impacts, fueled by stimulants and adrenaline. Her eyes burned, but her mind was razor-sharp. "Repeat the pattern analysis," she said. "Focus on shield modulation during impact events." Her team complied without question. There was no time for hierarchy now, only competence. Mara watched as models updated, lines of probability shifting. The alien shields were formidable, but they were not static. They adjusted, optimized against perceived threats. That adaptability was their strength, but it also meant they could be led, nudged into predictable responses. "They think we're simple," Mara said softly. "Linear." She pulled up historical analogues, not of alien invasions, but of human conflicts. Sieges where weaker forces had prevailed by exploiting the assumptions of stronger foes. Guerrilla wars, asymmetric tactics, moments where creativity had trumped brute force. "We can't beat them head-on," she said, stating the obvious. "But we don't have to, we just have to make them wrong." Hours blurred together. On the plateau, Joran's platform took glancing hits as orbital debris rained down, casualties mounted, cities burned. And still, humanity did not break. Civilian broadcasts shifted from panic to grim instruction. how to ration, how to shelter, how to help the wounded, how to keep going, Kelvaris began to feel something unfamiliar, a faint dissonance in their cognitive harmonics. The expected curve of resistance was not manifesting. Instead of a peak followed by collapse, the human response resembled a series of plateaus, each setback met not with despair but recalibration. They are inefficient, Vethrix insisted, though their confidence had frayed. Their losses are unsustainable, and yet, Kelvaris replied, they sustain them. A human strike finally achieved something more than noise. A coordinated volley, timed to exploit a brief window in shield cycling identified through relentless analysis, struck a conclave auxiliary vessel. The damage was superficial, scoring its hull and forcing it to withdraw for repairs. By conclave standards, it was trivial. By human standards, it was a roar of triumph. Across Sol 3, the moment was seized, amplified. Proof of concept spread faster than fear. They can bleed, the message said, in 1,000 languages and none at all. Kelvaris watched the data spike and felt the dissonance sharpen. Escalate, they commanded. Phase 2. Heavier weapons powered up. This time, inhabited targets would not be spared. The calculus of mercy was shifting. On the bastion of Rains, alarms screamed as targeting indicators flared crimson. Joran closed his eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them, resolve hardening into something like joy, not happiness, but clarity. Bring the guns to full, he said. If this is where we stand, then we stand. Above and below, in vacuum and atmosphere, the confrontation deepened, no longer a demonstration but a war. The conclave had come to teach inevitability. Humanity, bloodied and defiant, was beginning to teach something else entirely. That survival was not a curve to be predicted, but a choice renewed with every breath, every calculation, every stubborn refusal to accept an ending written by someone else. The conclave called it Phase 2, but the name was an artifact of their own need for orderly progression. What followed bore little resemblance to the clean escalations archived from previous conquests. When the heavier weapons fired, they did not simply destroy, they redefined terrain. Entire metropolitan regions vanished in pillars of constrained gravity that crushed structures into geological strata. Atmosphere boiled locally, then rushed back with hurricane force. The conclave expected the resulting shock to fracture human coordination, to replace defiance with survival panic. Instead, something subtler happened. The human response did fracture, but not along the lines the conclave anticipated. Rather than a single chain of command collapsing, humanity splintered into countless semi-autonomous cells that nevertheless shared information with ruthless efficiency. When a city died, its data lived. Sensor logs, tactical observations, last transmissions from doomed operators were harvested, compressed, and redistributed within minutes. Every loss became a lesson. Every failure sharpened the next attempt. Strategist Kelvaris watched this process unfold with growing unease. The models updated constantly, but their predictive confidence eroded. Human behavior did not converge towards surrender or despair. It oscillated, wildly at times, but always within a bounded range that suggested an underlying stabilizing force. Explain, Kelvaris demanded of the analytic chorus. The chorus responded with probabilities, not answers. Cultural resilience factors exceeded prior estimates. Distributed command structures showed unexpected robustness. Psychological thresholds for acceptable loss were recalibrating in real time. They are redefining acceptable loss, substrategist Vethrix said, their voice carrying an edge that would have been unthinkable days earlier. They are deciding that annihilation is preferable to submission. Kelvaris processed this silently. Many species reached that conclusion eventually, but usually too late to matter. Humanity was arriving there early and with alarming calm. On Sol 3's surface, the calm was hard-won. Mara Quent slumped back in her chair as another city marker faded from the global map, its population estimate replaced by a static memorial tag. She allowed herself 3 seconds of grief, no more. The habit had formed quickly, grief acknowledged and contained, like a hazardous material sealed behind protocol. New data from the polar array, an aide said. They're modulating their heavy emitters before firing. There's a lag, microseconds long, but it's consistent. Mara's eyes snapped back to the projections. Show me. The visualization bloomed, lines of energy cycling through alien constructs in patterns both elegant and alien. Yet beneath the complexity lay repetition. The conclave weapons were powerful, but they were optimized for efficiency, not redundancy. Power was routed along the shortest, cleanest paths. That made them fast. It also made them vulnerable to disruption if those paths could be stressed at the right moment. They don't expect us to see this, Mara murmured. Can we exploit it? The aide asked. Mara smiled, thin and feral. We can try. Trying had become humanity's most potent weapon. Above the plateau, the Bastion of Rains no longer resembled a pristine defense platform. Its hull bore scars where near misses had flayed armor away. Emergency patchwork gleamed dully where crews had welded plates under fire. Joran Malvek moved through the command deck like a man carved from momentum, issuing orders, encouraging exhausted operators, absorbing bad news, and turning it into action. Orbital fire incoming, Seren reported. Trajectory suggests a focused strike on our position. Joran nodded. They've noticed us. Sir, we can't take a direct hit from that class. We won't, Joran said. Prepare counterpattern Theta 7. Seren hesitated. That's experimental. So is extinction, Joran replied. Execute. The Bastion's guns reoriented, not to fire directly at the incoming threat, but to lay down a complex web of energy interference, tuned based on the latest shared data from analysts like Mara. It was messy, inefficient, and wildly outside conventional doctrine. It was also human. The conclave strike passed through the interference field and wavered. Not much. Enough. The focused gravity beam smeared, its lethal core diffusing into a broader, weaker effect that shook the Bastion violently but did not annihilate it. Consoles shattered. Crew were thrown from their stations. Fires broke out. The platform lived. Across human networks, the success propagated instantly. Another proof, another crack. Kelvaris watched the Bastion endure and felt the dissonance become something closer to irritation. They are interfering with weapon coherence, they said. Adjust emitters. We have, Vethrix replied. Repeatedly, they adapt faster than anticipated. How? Kelvaris demanded. Their processing capabilities are inferior. Their coordination is inefficient. They are inefficient individually, Vethrix said carefully. Collectively, they are exuberant. The word tasted wrong even as it was spoken, yet no other fit. Humanity threw ideas at the problem with reckless abundance. Most failed. Some failed catastrophically, but enough succeeded, and the cost of failure seemed to deter them less with each passing hour. The conclave escalated again. Ground forces deployed, sleek constructs descending through atmosphere on pillars of controlled force. They were not numerous by conclave standards. This was intended as a demonstration of inevitability, not occupation. Their arrival crushed fortifications and scattered defenders with contemptuous ease. They expected terror. They found resistance. Human ground forces were a patchwork of professional soldiers, reservists, volunteers, and civilians who refused to leave. Their equipment varied wildly, from cutting-edge prototypes rushed into service to weapons centuries old dragged from museums and modified in workshops. Their tactics were inconsistent, sometimes brilliant, sometimes suicidal. They fought anyway. In the ruins of a coastal city reduced to jagged skeletons of concrete and steel, Lieutenant Hana Vesk crouched behind a collapsed transit rail, her rifle humming softly as it charged. The air tasted of salt and ozone. Ahead, a conclave walker advanced, its geometry wrong in ways that made her eyes ache. Its weapons tracked smoothly, erasing cover with casual bursts. Focus fire on the joint, she shouted into the comm. Left side, second segment, her squad responded without hesitation. They had learned the hard way that Conclave constructs, though terrifying, were not invincible. They had joints. They had tolerances. They could be overwhelmed if hit from enough angles at once. Energy bolts splashed against the walker's armor, most dissipating harmlessly. Then one struck true, followed by another and another. The joint glowed, then fractured with a sound like a breaking bell. The walker lurched, its balance compromised. A cheer rose, cut short as return fire scythed through the rubble. Hana dragged a wounded soldier to cover, her mind already recalculating. Victory was always provisional. Survival was temporary, but temporary was enough. High above, Kelvaris observed the ground engagement feeds with mounting concern. Conclave ground forces were winning, but not cleanly. Each engagement took longer than predicted. Losses, while still acceptable, were accumulating at a rate that strained efficiency models. They are learning at the tactical level, Kelvaris said, not just strategically. Should we increase ground deployment? Vethrix asked. No, Kelvaris replied after a moment. That would reward their behavior. Instead, we will decapitate. The Conclave shifted focus to human leadership nodes. Command centers were identified and targeted. The goal was simple: remove coordination, force chaos, let despair finish the work. Some strikes succeeded, others failed spectacularly. Humanity had anticipated this move, not through foresight, but through bitter experience with its own wars. Leadership was already distributed, redundancies layered upon redundancies. When a command center vanished, its functions reappeared elsewhere within minutes. Mara Quent felt the tremor through the earth as a nearby facility ceased to exist. She did not flinch. Her team had already evacuated, data mirrored to a dozen locations. She watched the incoming feeds update and allowed herself a grim smile. They think cutting heads kills the body, she said. They don't understand how many heads we have. The war dragged into its second planetary rotation. Fires burned unchecked in many regions. Casualty numbers climbed beyond comprehension. Yet something extraordinary happened within the human psyche. Fear, while still present, no longer dominated. It settled into the background, a constant companion rather than a paralyzing force. In its place grew something older, something humanity had cultivated across millennia of hardship: stubbornness, the refusal to accept an externally imposed end. The willingness to suffer now for a future that might never come, simply because surrender was worse. Kelvaris reviewed updated projections and found them deeply unsatisfying. The probability of clean annexation had dropped precipitously. Even total extermination, once a remote contingency, now loomed as a potential outcome if escalation continued unchecked. The Conclave did not fear extermination of others, but it despised inefficiency. This campaign was becoming inefficient. They force us into extremes, Vethrix said quietly. Either commit fully or withdraw. Withdraw, Kelvaris repeated, tasting the concept. The word carried a weight bordering on taboo. The Conclave did not retreat lightly. Yet to persist would require a level of force that would yield little in return beyond a dead world and a bruised reputation. Not yet, Kelvaris decided. There is still a path. They authorized a communication attempt, not a demand but an offer. A revised annexation proposal, more generous, acknowledging human resilience, offering limited autonomy in exchange for compliance. The transmission went out, encoded with mathematical clarity. The response came hours later. It was not a unified message. It was not even addressed to the Conclave as a whole. It was a compilation, curated by no central authority, of voices from across Sol 3, soldiers in trenches, medics in ruined hospitals, children sheltering underground, scientists surrounded by flickering screens, civilians standing amid wreckage with dust-streaked faces and unbroken eyes. The message contained no threats, no boasts, no profanity. It contained refusal. But this time the refusal was articulated, layered with explanation. Humanity did not reject the offer because it was insufficient. It rejected it because submission, even comfortable submission, was an unacceptable precedent. They spoke of history, of tyrannies endured and overthrown, of mistakes repeated and lessons learned. They admitted their flaws freely. They did not claim moral superiority. They claimed only ownership of their future. Kelvaris watched the compilation in silence. There was no denying the coherence of it, despite its decentralized origin. This was not noise. This was identity. They are not bluffing, Vethrix said. No, Kelvaris agreed, they are not. For the first time since entering Sol, Kelvaris felt something dangerously close to respect. It complicated the calculus. Respect made annihilation distasteful. It also made annexation impossible. On the Bastion of Rains, Joran Malvek listened to the transmission with clenched fists. Around him, battered crew members paused in their labors, faces lit by the flickering projection. When it ended, there was no cheering, only a shared, steady breath. Well, Seren said quietly, that. Joran nodded. Whatever comes next, at least we chose it. Above them all, the Conclave fleet held position, weapons charged but unfired, its strategists recalculating futures that no longer fit familiar curves. Humanity had not won, not yet, but it had done something perhaps more dangerous. It had forced an empire built on inevitability to confront uncertainty, and in doing so, had proven that resistance was not merely a reaction, but a declaration of existence that no amount of force could easily erase. Uncertainty was not a state the Tarethi Conclave tolerated easily. Their civilization had been built on the premise that the universe, while vast, was ultimately innumerable, that every variable could be bounded, every outcome assigned a probability dense enough to justify action. Humanity had turned that premise into a liability. The Sol campaign now sat in an uncomfortable category within Conclave doctrine, a living system whose reactions fed back into themselves faster than external control could stabilize. Strategist Kelvaris convened the deliberative array, a council not of individuals but of synchronized minds, each tuned to a different analytical domain. Normally, such an array resolved disputes in moments. This time, the resonance took longer to settle, cognitive harmonics clashing and reforming. The cost curve is unacceptable, one analytic strain asserted. Even total extermination yields insufficient material return to justify expenditure. Reputational cost of withdrawal is non-trivial, countered another. Peripheral systems monitor conclave resolve. Precedent matters. A negotiated protectorate could preserve both resources and reputation, suggested a third. Kelvaris absorbed the chorus, filtering noise from signal. Humanity rejects subordination, they said, even symbolic. Then their destruction restores precedent, came the cold reply. Destruction teaches nothing if it produces martyrs rather than examples, Kelvaris said. We must understand what they are before we decide how they end. This was an unusual admission. The Conclave did not typically seek understanding beyond utility, yet Sol 3 had forced a deviation. Kelvaris authorized a shift in strategy. Direct planetary annihilation was paused. Instead, the fleet began a systematic campaign of selective pressure. Not random devastation, but targeted constraints designed to test human responses. Supply chains were disrupted. Orbital infrastructure was denied without immediate replacement. Key industrial nodes were threatened but not destroyed, creating dilemmas rather than corpses. The intent was to observe choice under strain. On Sol 3, the change was felt almost immediately. Mara Quent frowned at the updated threat maps scrolling before her. They're hurting us, she said, applying pressure without finishing the blow. What does that mean? An aide asked. It means they're studying decision-making, Mara replied. They want to see what we'll sacrifice when forced to choose. And what will we sacrifice? Mara leaned back, exhaustion etched deep into her features. That depends on who gets to choose. The question of choice fractured humanity along old fault lines that no invasion could instantly erase. Governments argued. Military commands disagreed. Civilian populations protested decisions that consigned certain regions to deprivation to preserve others. the unity forged under bombardment, strained under prolonged pressure. In one hemisphere, a coalition of city-states rerouted power from rural regions to sustain urban manufacturing, triggering riots and armed resistance. In another, agricultural zones were prioritized, starving industrial centers of energy. Every decision saved lives somewhere and doomed lives elsewhere. The conclave watched closely. They fracture when scarcity becomes political, Vethrix observed. Predictable, perhaps, Kelvaris replied, but watch what follows. What followed was not collapse, but argument, loud, messy, inefficient argument conducted under the shadow of extinction. Information flowed freely, accusations and justifications shared across global networks. Leaders were challenged openly, some were deposed. Others resigned rather than enforce decisions they could not morally defend. In several regions, command authority dissolved entirely, replaced by ad hoc councils composed of whoever was present and willing to act. These councils were fragile, prone to infighting, yet they continued to function, making choices and accepting consequences without waiting for permission. This should not work, Vethrix said. No, Kelvaris agreed. It should not. Captain Joran Malvek felt the strain keenly. The Bastion of Rains remained operational, but resupply was sporadic. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement parts were improvised from wreckage. Joran found himself making decisions that would have horrified him weeks earlier, choosing which sectors to cover and which to abandon based on incomplete data and gut instinct. A civilian convoy requested escort through a contested airspace. Granting it would expose a military installation to orbital fire. How many civilians? Seren asked. Estimate is 12,000, Joran replied. And the installation? Critical, Seren said. Losing it will cost us ground defense across 3 regions. Joran closed his eyes briefly. In another war, another life, the choice might have been clear. Here, clarity was a luxury. We escort the conv, he said. Seren nodded without comment and relayed the order. The installation was destroyed hours later. Ground defenses faltered. Casualties mounted. The convoy survived, its passengers dispersing into shelters and safe zones. Joran logged the decision personally, recording his reasoning for anyone who might one day judge it. He doubted anyone would. Above, the conclave recorded the event as data. A human commander had prioritized civilian lives over strategic assets. The probability curves shifted slightly. They choose values over optimization, Vethrix noted. Not always, Kelvaris replied, but often enough to matter. As days stretched into weeks, the selective pressure campaign revealed a paradox. Humanity fractured under moral stress, but the fractures did not propagate cleanly. Instead of cascading failure, there was constant recombination. Groups broke apart, reformed, aligned temporarily, then diverged again. The system never settled into a stable state long enough for the conclave to exploit decisively. It is like trying to grasp flowing water, Vethrix said in frustration. Yes, Kelvaris replied, and like water they erode. Human innovation accelerated under constraint. Deprived of certain technologies, engineers repurposed others in ways the conclave had not anticipated. Low-tech solutions proliferated alongside desperate high-tech gambits. When orbital manufacturing was denied, ground-based fabrication surged. When centralized power grids failed, localized generation spread like mycelium through infrastructure ruins. Mara Quent oversaw one such adaptation. A network of microsensors, originally designed for climate monitoring, was retooled to provide real-time tracking of conclave ground units. Individually, the sensors were trivial. Collectively, they painted a dynamic picture of enemy movement that compensated for humanity's lack of orbital superiority. They keep cutting our eyes, an aide said, so we grow more. Mara smiled faintly. Exactly. The conclave noticed. They replaced centralized vulnerabilities with distributed resilience, Kelvaris said. Every pressure we apply teaches them something. Then apply overwhelming force and end it, Vethrix insisted. Kelvaris hesitated. The option remained. A coordinated strike could sterilize the planet within hours. The Conclave had done worse for less provocation. Yet something restrained them now, not mercy, but calculation of a different kind. What do we become, Kelvaris asked, if we destroy a species that demonstrates this level of adaptive will? Vethrix recoiled slightly. We become what we have always been, victors. Or stagnation, Kelvaris countered. Empires that never encounter resistance capable of teaching them decay from certainty. This was dangerous thinking, yet it resonated within the deliberative array more than Kelvaris expected. On Sol 3, humanity reached a breaking point that did not look like collapse. It looked like choice. A coalition of surviving global institutions issued a proposal, not to the Conclave, but to humanity itself. It acknowledged the unsustainable nature of prolonged resistance and laid out options with brutal honesty. Continued fighting with probable extinction, negotiated submission with survival under alien oversight, or a third path, unprecedented and perilous. The third path involved escalation not outward, but inward. Humanity would dismantle its remaining centralized structures voluntarily, abandoning the illusion of unified governance entirely. Every region, every city, every community would decide its own fate. Some might submit, others would fight. Humanity as a species would no longer speak with one voice. The proposal sparked outrage, fear, and debate. Critics called it abdication. Supporters called it honesty. Mara Quent read the proposal 3 times, then forwarded it to every analyst node she trusted with a single annotation. This might be what they can't predict. Captain Joran Malvek received the same document hours later. He stared at it in silence, feeling the weight of it settle into his bones. If this passes, Seren said carefully, we may be on our own. Joran nodded. We already are. Across the planet, votes were cast where voting was still possible. In other regions, councils decided by acclamation or force. The result was not unanimous, but it was sufficient. Humanity decentralized itself deliberately, severing the last illusion of a single negotiable entity. The Conclave watched in stunned silence as their primary lever vanished. They have removed the concept of surrender, Vethrix said. There is no authority left to compel compliance, nor to threaten into submission, Kelvaris added. What remains? Vethrix demanded. Only annihilation, Kelvaris said, or coexistence. The latter word hung in the cognitive space like an untested hypothesis. Human resistance did not become easier to defeat after decentralization. It became harder. Some regions did submit, entering into localized ceasefires with conclave units. Others intensified resistance, fighting not for species-wide victory, but for local survival and dignity. The patchwork frustrated every attempt at strategic closure. Losses mounted on both sides, not enough to cripple the conclave, but enough to erode confidence. Peripheral systems began to ask questions. If Sol 3 required this much effort, what did that say about future expansions? Kelvaris felt the weight of history pressing in. Decisions made here would echo far beyond this system. On the Bastion of Rains, Joran watched a sunrise filtered through smoke and orbital debris. The light caught on twisted metal and scarred rock, painting the destruction in colors that were almost beautiful. We might not win, Seren said quietly. Joran considered this, then nodded. Probably not. Then why keep going? Joran looked out over the battered horizon. Because stopping means agreeing that someone else gets to decide when we end. Above, the conclave fleet remained poised, weapons ready, certainty eroding. Humanity had not offered victory, it had offered a dilemma. To destroy them would be easy, to understand them would be costly, to leave them alone would be unprecedented. And in that tension, in that unresolved equation, the war entered a new phase, one not defined by force alone, but by the terrifying possibility that the universe had produced a species whose greatest weapon was not technology or numbers, but the refusal to fit neatly into anyone else's future. The conclave had encountered resistance before, even stubborn resistance, but never resistance that weaponized ambiguity itself. Sol 3 was no longer a single problem to be solved. It was a field of problems, constantly rearranging, denying closure. Strategist Kelvaris recognized the danger not in the losses incurred, but in the precedent forming within conclave cognition. Uncertainty, once tolerated as noise, was becoming structural. To address this, the conclave did something extraordinary. They sent envoys, not conquerors, not heralds of annexation, but observers authorized to engage directly with human populations under strict constraints. The goal was intelligence, not domination. Understanding, not submission. It was a calculated risk that would have been unthinkable before Sol 3. The first envoy descended near what had once been a temperate inland sea, now a patchwork of flooded basins and exposed salt flats after orbital impacts had shifted tectonic balances. The landing craft did not crush the ground or announce itself with force. It settled gently, almost apologetically, its hull refracting light into muted colors. Human scouts surrounded it within minutes. Weapons were raised, targeting systems locked. Fingers hovered over triggers made for killing things that bled, not things that shimmered. The hatch opened. The envoy emerged slowly, deliberately unarmed. Its form was tall and asymmetrical, composed of layered structures that pulsed faintly with internal light. It made no sudden movements. It broadcast a narrowband signal that human translators scrambled to interpret. "I am here," the signal resolved, "to observe and to listen." The humans did not fire, not because they trusted it, but because curiosity ran alongside fear, as it always had. The standoff stretched. Eventually, a human stepped forward, lowering her weapon but not disengaging its safety. "Then listen," she said aloud, knowing translation would lag but trusting redundancy. "And don't pretend you won't judge what you hear." The envoy inclined its upper structure. "Judgment is inevitable. Understanding is optional. I am tasked with attempting the latter." Similar encounters unfolded across the planet. In some regions, envoys were attacked and destroyed. In others, they were ignored. But in enough places to matter, dialogue began. Fragmented, tense, often hostile dialogue, but dialogue nonetheless. Kelvaris received the reports with intense focus. Each interaction was a data trove, not of military capability, but of motivation. Humans spoke of survival, yes, but also of autonomy, of stories passed down through generations about resisting forces larger than themselves. They spoke of failure openly, of atrocities committed by their own kind, of shame and pride intertwined so tightly they could not be separated. "They do not mythologize themselves consistently," Vethrix observed. "They admit weakness." "And yet they persist," Kelvaris replied. "That is the paradox. On Sol 3, the presence of envoys changed the texture of the war, not its brutality, but its meaning. Some human communities saw the envoys as an opportunity to negotiate local truces, to spare their children further bloodshed. Others saw them as spies to be eradicated. Both responses were correct within their own frames. Mara Quent participated in one such dialogue remotely, her image projected into a half-ruined civic hall where an envoy hovered amid wary humans. "You want to understand us," Mara said, voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "Fine, here it is. We don't think we're special. We think we're stubborn. We know the universe doesn't owe us anything. But we also know that if we give up the right to decide our own fate, we lose the only thing that's ever gotten us through disasters we created ourselves." The envoy processed this for a long moment. "Your species accepts internal catastrophe more readily than external control." "Yes," Mara said, "because internal catastrophe leaves room for regret. External control doesn't." That exchange rippled outward through conclave networks. It did not change policy immediately, but it altered weighting. Humanity was no longer merely a resource-rich system with an unruly population. It was a case study in a mode of existence the conclave had never fully accounted for. Meanwhile, the war ground on. Captain Joran Malvek's Bastion of Rains became a node of legend, not because it was invincible, but because it refused to disengage even when cut off from formal support. Crews rotated through exhaustion, some leaving to defend their home regions, others arriving with barely any training. Joran accepted them all. One night, as emergency lights cast long shadows across the deck, Seren approached him quietly. "We intercepted something," she said. "Not an attack." Joran raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" "A withdrawal," Seren said. "Localized. Conclave ground units pulling back from 3 regions. No explanation." Joran stared at the tactical display. "Why?" Seren hesitated. "Because the population there stopped fighting. Submitted." "No," Seren said. "They dispersed. Abandoned cities. Went dark. No infrastructure left worth holding. Nothing to control." Joran exhaled slowly. "They made themselves useless." "Yes," the tactics spread. Communities that could not fight chose to vanish, melting into terrain, dismantling what could not be carried, denying the Conclave both resources and targets. It was not victory, it was denial. Kelvaris analyzed this development with growing concern. They are willing to erase themselves locally to preserve autonomy globally. "This borders on self-destruction," Vethrix said. "From our perspective," Kelvaris replied. "From theirs, it is continuity by other means." Pressure mounted within the Conclave. Some strategists argued that the Sol campaign was consuming disproportionate attention. Others feared that withdrawing without resolution would embolden resistance elsewhere. Peripheral systems watched closely, interpreting every hesitation. The deliberative array fractured along philosophical lines. Was the Conclave an engine of order, imposing stability regardless of cost, or was it an adaptive entity that must evolve when confronted with novel forms of intelligence? The question had never mattered before. It mattered now. On Sol 3, humanity paid dearly for every day the war continued. Famine loomed in several regions. Disease followed displacement. Entire cultures were reduced to archives and memory, yet the species did not collapse. Birth rates dipped, then stabilized. Art emerged in ruins, scratched onto walls, encoded into data packets flung into space not as messages of surrender, but as declarations of existence. Mara Quent encountered one such packet while monitoring deep space noise. It contained no strategic information, only stories, short accounts of human lives, anonymized, translated automatically into dozens of languages and mathematical frameworks. She forwarded it to every channel she could reach, including those suspected of Conclave monitoring. "Let them see what they're erasing," she said. The Conclave saw it. Archivists flagged it as irrelevant. Kelvaris overrode the flag and reviewed the packet personally. They did not experience emotion as humans did, but something in the recursive patterns of human narrative unsettled them. The stories were inefficient, emotionally dense, resistant to compression. They carried meaning not reducible to outcome. "This is what they preserve," Kelvaris said quietly. "Not territory, not even survival alone. Continuity of meaning." The war reached an inflection point when a Conclave flagship was destroyed, not through superior firepower, but through accumulated human ingenuity. A coordinated operation spanning multiple decentralized cells exploited a rare alignment of Conclave fleet formations, sensor-blind spots, and localized gravitational anomalies caused by prior bombardment. The attack was messy, improvised, and staggeringly risky. It worked. The flagship did not explode cleanly. It tore itself apart, internal systems cascading into failure as feedback loops human analysts barely understood amplified beyond control. Thousands of Conclave minds were lost. Shock rippled through the fleet. "That should not have been possible," Vethrix said, their composure finally cracking. "And yet," Kelvaris replied, "it was. Retaliation was immediate and devastating. Entire regions were scoured in response. Humanity bled, but something fundamental had shifted. The Conclave could no longer pretend this was a controlled engagement. They had been hurt in a way that mattered symbolically. Peripheral systems took note. Within the deliberative array, a motion was raised that had not been invoked in centuries, strategic disengagement pending re-evaluation. It was not retreat. The word was never used. It was a pause, framed as analysis. Kelvaris supported the motion. The cost of certainty here exceeds its benefit, they argued. If we persist, we either annihilate a species that will haunt our historical calculus, or we are forced to change. Withdrawal preserves the option to learn. The motion passed by a narrow margin. Orders went out. The Conclave fleet began a phased withdrawal from Sol space, maintaining defensive posture but ceasing offensive operations. Ground units disengaged where possible. Envoys were recalled or left behind with limited autonomy. On Sol 3, the change was felt slowly, then all at once. Bombardment ceased. The sky, scarred and altered, grew quieter. People emerged from shelters into a world still broken, but no longer actively ending. Captain Joran Malvek watched conclave vessels recede like dark thoughts slipping from consciousness. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a wary disbelief. "They're leaving," Seren said. "For now," Joran replied. Mara Quent sat amid ruins and wept for the first time since the invasion began, not from relief alone, but from the accumulated weight of everything lost and everything that might yet be demanded. Above them, strategist Kelvaris observed the withdrawal with a mind already racing ahead. Humanity had not defeated the Conclave, but it had forced it to reconsider its own nature. That, Kelvaris suspected, might be more dangerous than any weapon. The war was not over. It had simply entered a quieter, more uncertain phase, one where humanity's survival posed a question the universe itself might not be ready to answer. Silence did not follow the withdrawal. Not peace, not closure, not even relief in its pure form. What followed was a long, trembling exhale, the kind that comes after narrowly avoiding death, when the body has not yet accepted that the danger has passed. The sky over Sol 3 remained crowded with debris and distant watchers. The Conclave fleet had pulled back beyond immediate strike range, but it had not vanished. Humanity understood this instinctively. Predators that truly lave do not keep their distance measured to the decimal. The first weeks after the cessation of active bombardment were among the hardest. Systems that had been held together by desperation alone began to fail. Emergency rationing collapsed into famine in regions already hollowed out by displacement. Medical infrastructure, run beyond endurance, buckled as accumulated injuries and untreated illnesses demanded attention all at once. The adrenaline of survival ebbed, leaving exhaustion, grief, and anger in its wake. There was no global celebration. There could not be. Too many cities were gone. Too many names had become numbers and then statistics and then silence in the data streams. Humanity had survived the immediate threat, but survival did not feel like victory. It felt like standing amid ruins, holding a weapon with no clear enemy left to strike. Captain Joran Malvek oversaw the decommissioning of the Bastion of Rains with a sense of unreality. The platform had been designed for constant motion, for engagement and response, not for rest. Now it sat inert on the plateau, power levels reduced, weapons safed. Crews disembarked in uneven waves, some laughing too loudly, others staring blankly at the ground as if gravity itself was suspect. Joran walked the length of the deck one last time, running a hand along scarred bulkheads. Each mark told a story. Each story carried names. He had memorized too many of them. Seren Kale joined him near the edge, where the plateau dropped away into a valley reshaped by bombardment. "What now?" she asked. Joran considered the question. In war, now was always obvious. Now was fight or move or die. This now was shapeless. "Now we rebuild," he said finally, "and we argue about how." Seren huffed a tired laugh. "We're very good at that." "Yes," Joran agreed, "we are." Across Sol 3, arguments erupted with a ferocity that rivaled the fighting. With the external threat diminished, internal fractures widened. Accusations flew between regions that had submitted locally and those that had fought to the last. Refugees demanded restitution from communities that had closed their borders. Leaders who had risen during the war faced scrutiny, their emergency powers questioned, their decisions dissected with the benefit of hindsight sharpened by pain. Some called for reunification, for the restoration of a single planetary authority to prepare for the conclave's inevitable return. Others rejected the very idea, pointing to how quickly centralized power had become a target and a liability. The proposal that had shattered humanity into autonomous fragments during the war did not dissolve when the pressure eased. It calcified into a new reality. Mara Quent found herself at the center of these debates despite having no desire to lead. Her analyses had circulated widely during the war, and now people looked to her for certainty she did not possess. In a makeshift forum assembled within the skeletal remains of an old research complex, Mara addressed a gathering of representatives whose legitimacy varied wildly. "There is no configuration that guarantees safety," she said, her voice echoing slightly off broken walls. "Anyone promising you that is lying to you or to themselves. Centralization makes us visible and efficient. Decentralization makes us resilient and messy. We survived because we were messy." "Messy doesn't rebuild infrastructure," someone shouted. "No," Mara replied. "People do, and people disagree. That's not a flaw we can engineer away." The debates did not resolve cleanly. Instead, humanity settled into a patchwork future that mirrored its wartime existence. Some regions federated loosely, others remained fiercely independent. Trade resumed unevenly, knowledge flowed more freely than authority. It was unstable, inefficient, and alive. Above them, the conclave watched. Strategist Kelvaris had not returned to the conclave core worlds. They remained with the observation detachment, tasked with long-term monitoring of Sol 3. Officially, this was to assess whether humanity posed a future threat or opportunity. Unofficially, Kelvaris knew they had been left here because no one else wanted to sit with the implications. Humanity had not been conquered. It had not been exterminated. It had not been absorbed. It had resisted in a way that left no clean outcome. Reports filtered in from other systems. Peripheral worlds had taken note of Sol 3. Resistance movements referenced humanity openly now, not as saviors or allies, but as proof that inevitability was a negotiable concept. The Conclave's reputation for absolute dominance had acquired a fracture, thin but spreading. "This is contamination," Vethrix said during one of their increasingly tense exchanges. "Ideological contamination." "Yes," Kelvaris replied, "of the most persistent kind." Envoys left behind on Sol 3 continued their work, some openly, some covertly. They observed rebuilding efforts, cultural shifts, the ways humans memorialized their dead without surrendering to paralysis. They noted how quickly new conflicts arose even in the absence of an alien enemy. Humanity did not become noble in survival. It became itself, with all the contradictions intact. One envoy transmitted a particularly troubling observation. "They do not unify in triumph," it reported. "They diversify." Kelvaris understood why this unsettled the conclave. Empires thrived on predictable reactions. Humanity's post-war behavior defied the usual pattern. There was no golden age of unity, no singular narrative of victory to be mythologized and eventually exploited. There were thousands of stories, many of them mutually incompatible. This made humanity difficult to manipulate. Months passed. Conclave presence in Sol space dwindled further, observation platforms pulling back incrementally. Trade probes skirted the system but did not enter. The war faded from immediate memory even as its scars remained omnipresent. Then came the signal. It was not a message addressed to humanity. It was not addressed to the conclave either. It was a broadcast, wide spectrum, encoded redundantly in mathematics, physics constants, visual patterns, and narrative constructs. It originated from Sol 3 but did not ask for recognition or response. Mara Quent detected it first, long-range instruments lighting up with familiar complexity. "What is that?" an aide asked. Mara's breath caught. "A declaration." The signal contained a compressed record of humanity's encounter with the Conclave, not propaganda, not accusation. A factual account, annotated with human perspectives, mistakes included. It detailed strategies used, losses sustained, adaptations made. It ended not with a warning or a boast, but with a statement. We are here. We do not know if we will endure. We will decide for ourselves. The signal was launched not toward Conclave space specifically, but outward into the wider galaxy. A message not of dominance, but of presence. Kelvaris received the signal with a sensation best described as vertigo. Humanity had not merely survived an invasion, it had chosen to insert itself into the broader cosmic discourse on its own terms, without permission. They are inviting attention, Vethrix said. This is reckless. Yes, Kelvaris replied, and deliberate. Within the conclave, the signal ignited fierce debate. Some argued it was a provocation that demanded immediate suppression. Others saw it as an opportunity, a chance to reshape relations not just with humanity, but with the galaxy itself. The conclave had always assumed it defined the terms of contact. Humanity had refused that assumption entirely. Captain Joran Malvek watched the launch of the signal from a small gathering on the plateau where the Bastion of Rains had once stood. The platform itself had been dismantled, its materials repurposed into shelters and power relays. Only the plateau remained, scarred but solid. "Do you think they'll come back?" someone asked him. "Yes," Joran said without hesitation. "When?" Joran shook his head. "I don't know, and that's the point." Humanity had learned to live without certainty. It had been forced into that lesson by fire and loss, but it had not rejected it once learned. The future was no longer a promised arc toward progress or doom. It was a contested space, shaped by choices made daily, locally, imperfectly. For the conclave, Sol 3 became a reference point that could not be neatly archived. Strategist Kelvaris submitted their final report with an addendum that violated several conventions. "Humanity is not an anomaly to be corrected," the addendum read. "It is a variable that alters the system in which it exists. Continued engagement will require adaptation on our part. Avoidance will not restore prior conditions." The report was circulated, debated, and quietly archived. Some would read it as caution, others as challenge. Far from the halls of conclave deliberation, humanity continued, arguing, rebuilding, failing, trying again. Children were born who would not remember the sky falling. Stories were told that could not capture the terror, but tried anyway. New myths formed, less about victory and more about refusal. The war had not given humanity a crown or a destiny. It had given it something more dangerous, a reputation. And as the galaxy slowly, uneasily absorbed the signal from Sol 3, that reputation began to take on weight, not as a promise of salvation or conquest, but as a warning written between the lines of history. Here was a species that would not fit. Here was a species that would not stay quiet. Here was a species that, when measured by empires built on certainty, returned results that broke the instruments used to measure them. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive. The question was what the universe would become now that it had. Time did what neither fleet nor fire could. It stretched the moment of survival into something harder and more demanding: continuity. Humanity discovered that enduring after the end of a war was not a return to normal, because normal had been incinerated along with so much else. The future was not rebuilt atop the past. It was assembled from fragments that did not quite fit, held together by necessity and argument and the shared memory of how close the species had come to erasure. The years that followed the withdrawal were uneven. Some regions stabilized quickly, leveraging preserved infrastructure and dense populations to re-establish trade, education, and manufacturing. Others lingered in long recoveries, entire generations growing up amid ruins that slowly softened under weather and encroaching vegetation. There was no single narrative of recovery, no unified calendar of progress. Humanity moved forward at different speeds, in different directions, bound together less by governance than by information. The signal humanity had sent continued to propagate outward, its redundancy ensuring it would survive noise, interference, and deliberate suppression. It was picked up by listening arrays and accidental receivers alike. Some ignored it, some archived it, some studied it with interest that bordered on hunger. The Conclave could not stop that without committing to a campaign far larger than Sol 3 alone, and they did not commit. Instead, they adapted in the only way empires ever truly do when confronted with something they cannot erase. They reframed. Within Conclave doctrine, Sol 3 was reclassified. No longer a target for annexation, it became a monitored anomaly zone, a living example used in advanced strategic training. Cadets studied the campaign not for how to win it, but for how it had unraveled. The name humanity assigned itself became associated with a cautionary principle. Systems that self-modify under observation invalidate static control models. Strategist Kelvaris remained at the center of this intellectual shift. Their influence grew quietly, not through proclamation, but through the slow accretion of credibility. Predictions that once would have been dismissed as overly conservative proved accurate in system after system. Resistance movements elsewhere began to emulate not human tactics, but human philosophy, decentralization, redundancy, refusal to offer singular points of failure. This is metastasis, some in the Conclave argued. They are infecting the galaxy. Kelvaris did not disagree. Yes, they said, with possibility. The Conclave did not collapse. Empires rarely do all at once, but its expansion slowed. Its assumptions softened. Its certainties acquired footnotes. That alone altered the balance of power in subtle but irreversible ways. On Sol 3, humanity noticed none of this immediately. Its concerns were smaller and closer to home, feeding populations, healing land poisoned by bombardment. Deciding which histories to teach children who had no memory of the invasion and no instinctive fear of the sky. Mara Quent transitioned out of crisis analysis into education, helping build a distributed network of learning hubs that emphasized systems thinking and historical literacy over rote instruction. She insisted that students be taught not just what happened during the war, but how decisions had been made under uncertainty and how often those decisions had been wrong. Survival doesn't make us right, she told them. It just means we're still here to be wrong again. Captain Joran Malvek did not seek office or command after the war. He drifted for a time, visiting regions the Bastion of Rains had once defended, meeting people who recognized his name and others who did not care. Eventually, he settled in a highland community that had dismantled its remaining weapons to build irrigation systems. He helped where he could, lifting stones, repairing structures, listening more than he spoke. When asked why he stayed, he answered simply, because this is what all that fighting was for. Humanity did not become united. It did not become peaceful. Conflicts erupted between regions, sometimes violent, sometimes merely bitter. Old prejudices resurfaced in new forms. New technologies created new inequalities. Progress was uneven and often cruel. And yet, extinction did not return. The Conclave watched, waiting for the collapse that their models still insisted must come eventually. It did not arrive on schedule. Humanity stumbled, adapted, and stumbled again, refusing to converge toward either utopia or ruin. It existed in a persistent middle state that defied elegant classification. Decades after the war, the first non-conclave vessel arrived in Sol space. It was small, fragile by comparison to the fleets humanity remembered. Its approach was cautious, almost timid. It broadcast no demands, no declarations of superiority. Its signal was a question. Humanity answered, not with a unified voice, but with many. Some warned it away. Some invited it closer. Some ignored it entirely. The vessel remained, listening, adjusting its approach with care. Kelvaris observed this encounter from afar, feeling the long arc of consequence tighten. The galaxy had begun to respond to humanity not as a conquered subject or a mythic victor, but as a node of interaction, a place where assumptions went to be tested. This was inevitable, Vethrix said during one of their final exchanges. No, Kelvaris replied. It was chosen by them, and now by others. Humanity did not dominate the galaxy. It did not lead it. It did not save it. What it did was far more destabilizing. It demonstrated that refusal itself could be a form of power, that survival did not require purity, unity, or moral clarity, only persistence and the willingness to adapt without surrendering agency. That an empire built on certainty could be forced to hesitate, and that hesitation could echo outward, altering futures not yet imagined. The universe adjusted, as it always did, not through grand resolutions, but through countless small recalibrations. Trade routes shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, conflicts flared and faded. Through it all, the memory of Sol 3 endured, not as legend, but as reference. A reminder that inevitability was not a law of nature. It was a story told by those who had never met a species willing to argue with the universe itself and continue anyway. Humanity did not claim the future. It occupied it, and that, in the end, proved to be enough.